Now, it was the environmentalist J. Westerveld who coined the term greenwashing as far back as 1986. And as the climate crisis has advanced, many in the corporate world have been accused legitimately of putting a green sheen on their products and services. Our next guest is not one of them. I have spoken to him for many years now on the issue of sustainability. Please give a warm welcome to Colin Hunt, CEO of AIB, one of today's main sponsors. Colin. Colin, we have, over the last couple of years, spoken a lot about sustainability through your sustainability conference that I've been very, very lucky to be part of with AIB. So we've spoken many times before, and I've always been struck by how personally committed you are to this issue. And I know, a bit like charity, sustainability has begun for you at home because a lot of the drive comes from Colin's three daughters who instigated, I think the last time we spoke, a palm oil ban in the house. And I was just curious to see, had it extended to the hazelnut chocolate spread just yet? It had been a gradual kind of change, the ban, but have they kept the chocolate spread?
Well, we found sustainably sourced chocolate spread, but they didn't like it. So they continue to award themselves an ongoing exemption in relation to their preferred brand. But other than that, they're still very much...
Yeah, it is extraordinary though. It is a lot, to their credit, the younger generation who have been making demands in this area.
Yeah, well, I think they're the ones who are going to inherit the earth from us. And what is currently happening is truly terrifying. Like scientists have been warning us about our climate for decades. And we've been choosing to ignore them. And we're currently on a trajectory that will have the world warming by about 4 degrees Celsius between now and 2030. That's where we're headed. Now, in order to sustain life as we know it, and in order to avoid catastrophic and cataclysmic climate events, we need to limit that to about 1.5, maybe 2 at the outset, but ideally 1.5. We're nowhere near hitting it. And one of the things that worries me about medium-term targets in this particular area is that when we talk about 2030, people say, oh, sure, that's years away. How many crises is that away from us? And it creates a real sense of complacency. Minister Martin was here yesterday, absolutely right, this is the decade of change. This is the decade we need to make the changes. I think actually we need to make the changes in the next 3 years.
The next 3 years?
Next
so
3 years.
We don't have 10 years.
If we don't seriously arrest and reverse this issue in the next 3 years, the chances of us having a sustainable path or a sustainable climate in 2030 will be significantly small.
So are we running out of time?
The clock is against us, and one of the things that concerns me is when we see another crisis looming, we sort of say, well, you know, I know sustainability is important, and climate change and climate action is vital, but like, let's focus on the here and now, and we'll come back to that. But time is against us, and time is running out, and we're not making the progress we need to make. Like, you mentioned Black Swan earlier. The global financial crisis was supposed to be our Black Swan. That was the big existential event. But it was followed very quickly. Now, we came out of the global financial crisis. We're getting back up on our feet and we're hit by Brexit. Another Black Swan. Beginning to come to terms with the threat and the reality of a borderline hardish Brexit. And we're hit by COVID. Learning to live with COVID. And along comes Vladimir Putin's outrageous, murderous...
researching this, actually. I was trying to work with the collective noun for a swan, and the collective noun for a swan is a lamentation. So are we in a sort of a permanent state of lamentation where what you've talked about, these individual black swans, are just constantly coming at us? And how does this crisis, you know, compare? Look, if you go back to the global financial crisis, does that mean the halcyon days were last in the what? The late 1990s? Early 2000s?
2005, 2006 felt reasonably good. That was before the world went hard shortly afterwards. but making a serious point, and I think this is somewhat encouraging, and it sort of ties in surprisingly with some of the things that David said, and that is that if we were sitting here in 2007 and said, in the next 15 years, we're going to have a collapse of the Irish economy, we're going to have a collapse of the Irish banking system, we're going to see house prices halving, we're going to see commercial property values falling by 60%, we're going to see a global pandemic, we're going to see Britain leaving the European Union, and Vladimir Putin is going to bring us to the cusp of a nuclear war. Now, you would have been terrified, and they were all individually terrifying events, but the really amazing thing to me is the extraordinary resilience of this species. Like, we've come through each of those crises, and we haven't relented in terms of our focus and our desire to push ahead, and we need to put some of that energy and concentration into the immediate challenge, which is climate action.
AIB has been on a sustainability or recovery journey of its own, both in terms of addressing climate, but also as a bank that's coming out of significant state support from the last, the global financial crisis. You took over as CEO in 2020. What has that...
2019,
late
8th of March.
Yes, never forget.
7 a.m. to be precise.
Just as the markets opened. But around that period of time, when you talk about that sustainability journey, what does it actually mean in practice for the bank as a lending institution, but also in addressing climate?
It's a massive opportunity. Like, I'm not sitting here as some reconstituted philanthropist when it comes to climate change. This is a massive, massive opportunity for the bank. Like, just to give you an idea of numbers around this, and bankers love numbers, and even non-practicing economists like numbers. Our lending book today is about 60 billion. The IMF estimates that every year between now and 2030, we're going to require investment in this economy of about 20 billion. So,
and where's that going to come from, that 20 billion?
So about 6 billion will come from the state, about 14 billion will come from the private sector. Now, we're in a position where we've got a very strong balance sheet, we're very well equipped in both capital and liquidity terms at the moment, and we are very, very eager to play our role. But it's great business for us. It also is a massive opportunity for us to deploy capital at scale in a very, very socially and environmentally responsible way. It is win-win. And I don't know who said it. I wish I had said it. And I'm saying it so often now that I'm almost getting the copyright on this. It is possible to do well and do good.
At the same time.
Yes.
About a fifth of all new lending, I think, last year was related to sort of green lending. How is that sustainability agenda, the climate agenda, changing the world of finance itself? We're looking at the issuing of green bonds, of funds, the green transition, blacklisting, or is it green listing? I'm not too sure. Companies or entities that don't accord with the climate agenda.
So it's a transition. What we've said is that we will be we'll be net zero in our own operations by 2030. We have reduced our carbon emissions by 71% since 2009, 19% in the last year alone. We have around 20% of our new lending now is green or transitional in nature. We're going to lift that to about 70% by the time we get to 2030. At the same time, we have an exclusions list, which is growing, which is businesses that we're not going to lend to. There are businesses...
You have a blacklist?
A blacklist?
A blacklist in terms of we can't...
a growing and expanding blacklist, and it's up on our website. You can go up and look at it. But where businesses are serious about making the transition, we will support them.
But does that mean, obviously, let's say, the fossil fuel industry, you can't, they have a huge role, actually, in addressing the climate agenda. So is it simply a question of turning off the financial tap for that, or what does that capital switch look like in practice, in trying to wean us all off?
Well, if a business is serious about reducing its carbon impact, we'll support them. We will provide them with the capital necessary to achieve that objective. But we're not going to support businesses that aren't serious about it. We're not going to support businesses that are actually damaging the environment and have no ambition to do anything other than damage the environment. Not going to happen. We're not in the business of doing that. And it leads to a situation where we turn away business. But I'm very happy for us to do it.
Cathy was speaking earlier about the supports for business and trying to help them level up. Are you, in a sense, even within the terms of supporting businesses, including SMEs, are you risk checking them against sustainability and climate?
Yeah, well, so it's within our own account. But this is an area that is subject to very welcome, increasingly intrusive scrutiny by regulators and by investors and by commentators and by the broad swathe of stakeholders. There's been even through COVID, some people said COVID is such a major crisis, we can park the issue of climate change for a while, we'll come back to that in 2 years' time. It didn't happen. It actually exposed how fragile our world is in a way that put sustainability at the top of the business agenda. And now, when I'm talking to shareholders, potential shareholders, if you go back 3 years, it was almost like a tick-the-box question towards the end of the presentation. Well, what are you doing about that ESG thing? Now it's a gatekeeping question.
And that gatekeeper question and ESG and the importance of it, even though it's happening maybe at an EU level or government level, that is going to cascade itself down to the smallest of businesses.
Yeah, so we will be required to gather information in terms of the carbon intensity of the businesses that we support, our customers. And we'll be required to report on that. And we'll be required to show progress in terms of reducing the carbon intensity of our lending book. That is, it is a burden, but it's a welcome one. And it's a burden that's going to be shared right the way across the financial services industry. And we are going to be engaging with all our customers in relation to finding out more about the environmental impact of their own businesses. But what is going to happen, undoubtedly, in my view, is that businesses that take this seriously are going to get a benefit in terms of the cost of funding and the availability of finance. And the businesses that don't take it seriously are going to suffer the opposite consequences. And ultimately,
well, what about those daunted businesses that we spoke about earlier who want to do it but who are looking at all sorts of costs, including David says the inflation, everything. Historically, we might look at this as a great period of change, but there are upfront costs and measures that are really affecting business. So how can they do that? And what role do financial institutions have in helping make sure that it's a just and a fair transition for business as well as for very vulnerable members of society?
Well, I think we all have a fairly good idea what we need to do, individually, collectively, and as businesses. This is not rocket science. There's nothing that's going to be earth-shattering in terms of what we can do as individuals to reduce to improve the way in which we consume the Earth's precious resources. There's no major rocket science here. There needs to be incentives for good behaviour. There needs to be sanctions for bad behaviour. But I do think that you are going to see black businesses and businesses that aren't on that transition path. We just want people to make an effort to start transitioning to a lower carbon future. Businesses that aren't on that are going to find it increasingly difficult to get capital. And when they do get capital, it's going to be more expensive.
When you look at the financial crisis wrought by the pandemic and everything that preceded it, as I was going to say, as a collapsed economist, as a lapsed economist, how do you think governments, including our own, fared in terms of, to the extent we did have control over monetary and fiscal policy and business supports? Because it seems we did learn the lesson of the last global financial crisis and stepped in, but were able to do so. I think part of the reason why there was a lot of solidarity was because money was there for people and businesses. And those supports they're not eternal.
Yeah. I'm going to say something a bit perverse, and that is that we were really, really lucky it was a global crisis, that it wasn't a localized crisis. And because it was a global crisis, the rule books were thrown out. So we've just come through the greatest economic experiment in history. All the monetary policy taps turned on. Negative interest rates flood the world with money, free money, effectively. Government budgetary restrictions in terms of deficit targets, so on, thrown out. Flood the world. And there was a concerted, unified policy approach the world over, which saw deliberate action on the part of central banks and on the part of governments to shove money out into the economies in order to protect the underlying fabric of our societies and our economies. And it worked. Now, we're working through the consequences of it. and there will be consequences of it, and there are consequences of it. Like long before Vladimir Putin decided to send tanks across the border into Ukraine, we were looking at a very significant uptick in inflation pressures. And that, in my view,
warehousing
is a
of debt,
consequence.
all of those measures.
Yeah.
Before we get back to
But you know what? It was an experiment worth engaging in, because the consequences of us not protecting the economies and the societies of the world would be unconscionable. So it was the right thing to do.
Now, rising interest rates is not necessarily bad for your business. So before I ask you, would you buy a house? I'll ask you this. In terms of AIB on that recovery sustainability journey, getting its own proverbial house in order, moving towards coming out of its own level of state support, how do you perceive that will go? I know you're probably about halfway on the repayment of that support during the last crisis. How do you anticipate that going? Will it go back as cash? Are there other measures? How would you like to see AIB at the end of its own recovery journey in circumstances where you're doing very well?
Well, first of all, AIB wouldn't be here but for the support of the Irish taxpayers. 12 years ago, we needed support to the tune of almost 21 billion euro, and the government and the Irish taxpayer was there to support us, and we have, I'm deeply conscious of that. We have made good progress in terms of repaying that. Something of the order of 11 billion repaid, and obviously the state remains the largest shareholder in the bank. But as I see it, my job is to, along with my colleagues, is to ensure that we are focused on the medium to long term, that we're building a strong, sustainable business that's there as a very strong and credible partner for our customers, and that we have the ability to stand by our customers in good times and in bad. Because I'm very conscious of the fact that we went into the GFC in a reasonably weak financial state. So, and I won't bore you with numbers, but there's a key measure of a bank's capital strength called its CET1. We went into the crisis in 2008, 2009 with a CET1 of about 5%. We went into this crisis with a CET1 of about 16%. So our focus has been on making sure our balance sheet is really, really strong so that we can be there to support our customers. And if we get that right, and I'm intent on us getting that right, well then we will ultimately be in a position whereby the Irish taxpayers' confidence in us will be rewarded.
The lamentation of individual black swans that we spoke about earlier, when you take all of those kind of together, and obviously David gave us a bit more historical, like how optimistic are you about in terms of the recovery and meeting the immediate challenges of the crisis in Ukraine, inflation, the housing crisis, everything? And would you buy a house? Just don't worry, Breda, won't leave you out. Well, first of all, there's no danger any of the guests here today are going to be commenting on the wonders of my hair. Somewhat slightly jealous of David, not for the first time on that front. Look, there are challenges out there. We are dealing with, I was out and about in Limerick, and I spent some time with Mary Constantine last week. It was great to get out of Dublin once again and go down to that wonderful part of the country. And there was a number of themes that kept on coming up. One was inflation. And we're not going to see inflation going back to 2% in the next number of quarters. It's going to be a while before the impact of Ukraine plus the great policy experiment works its way through. The second thing is labour. Like the most staggering feature of the Irish economy in the past 2 years has been the way we've rebounded in terms of the strength of the labour market. More people at work today in Ireland than at any point ever before in our history. Who'd have thought, here we come out of a pandemic and hey presto, there are more people at work in the state than ever before. And housing is another problem. But these are problems created by success. These are problems created by economic success. And it's going to take time to work through each and every one of them. But back to the housing market, the problem in 2007, 2008 is that we were building 95 to 97,000 units a year into a market which needed 40. So, the heat comes out of the system, the fervour goes, the speculative fervour disappears, and the market comes crashing down.
Today, we're building about 20,000 units into a market that needs, on a current basis, between 30 and 35,000.
So even though we're not far off those Celtic Tiger prices, you don't think we're going to go into...
Well, the key thing here is that this is a market which is structurally undersupplied at the moment. There are people out there, there's a significantly greater amount of fundamentally driven demand, like not 97,000 units, but 30,000 units, maybe a little bit higher than 30,000 units, where we are supplying about 20,000 into the market. We are going to be living, and that's just taking account of the current situation. Bear in mind the fact that we've been dealing with a market which has been materially undersupplied for 5 years. So there is a pool of unsatisfied housing demand out there. And we're going to need...
So would you buy a house?
I would buy a house, to be honest with you, and I'd come to AIB for a very well-priced mortgage. And in relation to building standards, our houses are getting better because we have significantly more onerous restrictions on builders and regulations in order to ensure that our houses are better built and are more energy efficient.
Well, the last thing I will say is I know you're building a solar farm, but you also have that gorgeous honey that you have from your honeybees on the roof of AIB. My jar has run out, so if you get a chance to send another one on, that would be great. Everyone, Colin Hunt, CEO of AIB.